I came to in a private hospital suite after collapsing without warning during dinner. Through the slightly open door, I heard my father whisper, "Are you certain she took it?" My stepbrother gave a low chuckle. "Calm down. By morning, everything will belong to us." For a moment, I thought I was still unconscious. The room smelled of antiseptic and expensive flowers. A heart monitor blinked steadily beside my bed, casting pale green light across the walls. My throat felt dry and a dull ache pulsed behind my eyes. But the cold spreading through my chest had nothing to do with whatever they had slipped into my drink. "Everything will belong to us." Those words echoed louder than the monitor. I carefully turned my head toward the door. Their shadows stretched across the hallway floor. My father's silhouette looked smaller than I. Remembered, nervous, impatient, the stepbrother he'd brought into my life 15 years earlier sounded perfectly relaxed. "Once she's gone," my stepbrother continued, "the company transfers exactly as planned." My stomach twisted. 3 months earlier, my grandfather had left me controlling ownership of our family's business empire. Publicly, everyone congratulated me. Privately, some people never accepted it. Apparently, they had chosen a more permanent solution. I kept my breathing slow and even, pretending to remain unconscious. My father sighed. "No mistakes?" "None." Silence followed. Then footsteps moved away from the room. I waited. 10 seconds. 20. 30. Only when I was certain they were gone did. I reached beneath my blanket and grabbed my phone. My hands trembled as I unlocked it. There was only one person I trusted, my attorney. A man who had spent years teaching me a simple rule. Never fight emotional people with emotion. Fight them with evidence. I typed 6 words. Activate the plan immediately. The message delivered instantly. Less than 30 seconds later, 3 dots appeared on my screen. His reply was only 4 words. Already anticipated this possibility. For the first time that night I smiled, because neither my father nor my stepbrother realized something important. They believed I was lying helpless in a hospital bed. What they didn't know was that months earlier, after noticing unusual behavior, missing documents, and suspicious financial transfers, I had quietly prepared for betrayal. And now, while they celebrated outside my door, they were already walking straight into a trap they had helped build themselves. My name is Elena Mercer, and for most of my life, people assumed everything I achieved came from my family name. They were wrong. My grandfather built our company from a single warehouse into a national business. But unlike everyone else in the family, I spent years learning every department from the ground up. I worked weekends in shipping, sat through endless budget meetings, and earned the respect of employees, who cared far more about results than bloodlines. My father never understood that. He preferred appearances over effort. After my mother died when I was 16, he remarried quickly and devoted himself to creating a new family. His stepson Ryan became the son he always wanted. Confident, charming, and skilled at taking credit for other people's work, Ryan knew exactly how to win admiration without earning it. I learned early that arguing only made me look emotional, while making them look reasonable. So I stopped arguing. I listened. I watched. I remembered. For years, family gatherings followed the same pattern. Ryan interrupted me and received laughter. I offered solutions and received silence. Later, someone would praise Ryan for repeating the exact idea I had shared earlier. My grandfather noticed. That was why his final decision shocked everyone. He left control of the company to me. The day his will was read, Ryan's smile vanished for a fraction of a second. My father recovered quickly, but I saw disappointment flash across his face before he buried it behind forced congratulations. That moment stayed with me, not because they were unhappy for me, because they looked like people who believed something valuable had been stolen from them. And now, lying in that hospital bed, listening to them discuss my death as if it were a business transaction, I finally understood what that look had meant all along. Looking back, the warning signs were everywhere. They were simply small enough to dismiss one at a time. A week after my grandfather's funeral, Ryan began appearing at meetings he had never attended before. He would sit quietly, tapping a pen against a notebook, listening as I presented quarterly plans. Then, when the discussion ended, he would casually restate one of my recommendations in different words. The board members would nod. My father would smile proudly. And somehow Ryan would leave with the credit. I noticed the pattern immediately. I also noticed who never corrected it. My father. Whenever I spoke, he interrupted with questions. When Ryan spoke, he listened patiently, hands folded, as though hearing wisdom from a trusted advisor. The difference was subtle enough to escape criticism, but obvious enough to sting. Outside the office, things grew stranger. Documents I requested arrived late. Important emails somehow excluded me. Decisions were discussed over private dinners I was never invited to attend. Each incident had a reasonable explanation. Together, they formed a picture I couldn't ignore. One evening, I walked into a conference room and conversation stopped instantly. Ryan leaned back in his chair. My father glanced toward him before forcing a smile. Neither man looked surprised to see me. They looked disappointed. The silence lasted only a second before polite greetings resumed, but something cold settled in my chest. It was the look people give when a conversation was never meant for your ears. From that day forward, I paid closer attention. And the more carefully I watched, the more I began to suspect that I wasn't being pushed aside by accident. I was being moved out of the way. The turning point arrived 3 weeks before I collapsed. It began with a routine financial review. Late one evening, long after most employees had gone home, I sat alone in my office studying expense reports. Rain tapped softly against the windows, while the city lights shimmered beyond the glass. At first, the numbers seemed ordinary. Then I noticed a transfer, a large one. The destination was a consulting firm I didn't recognize. I followed the paperwork. Another transfer appeared, then another. Each approval carried a different signature, but every trail eventually circled back to Ryan. My pulse slowed instead of quickening. That was when I knew, not suspected, knew. The missing emails, the private meetings, the carefully timed exclusions, none of it had been coincidence. Someone was quietly positioning assets, relationships, and influence away from my control. The next morning, I took the documents to my attorney. He reviewed them in silence, turning pages one by one. When he finally looked up, his expression told me everything. "This isn't carelessness," he said. "This is preparation." For a long moment, neither of us spoke. I stared through his office window at people moving along the street below. I thought about every insult I had ignored, every warning I had explained away, every opportunity I had given them to act like family. That was the moment I stopped hoping things would improve. Not because I wanted revenge, because I finally understood the truth. I wasn't dealing with people who wanted fairness. I was dealing with people who believed I would never fight back. So I made a decision, quietly, carefully, without telling anyone. If they were preparing a plan against me, I would prepare one of my own. And when the time came, I would let them make the first move. The following weeks were the quietest of my life. Outwardly, nothing changed. I attended meetings, reviewed reports, and accepted Ryan's false smiles without challenge. If anything, I became more agreeable. I stopped questioning decisions. I stopped correcting inaccuracies. I allowed them to believe I had finally become complacent. In reality, I was preparing. My attorney specialized in corporate litigation and asset protection. Together, we reviewed every ownership document, voting agreement, trust provision, and executive authorization connected to the company. We weren't searching for revenge. We were establishing facts. Every suspicious transfer was documented. Every unauthorized conversation was recorded in detailed notes. Immediately afterward, every financial irregularity was preserved with timestamps and supporting records. At my attorney's recommendation, we arranged independent audits through firms that reported directly to the board rather than management. We also created secure copies of sensitive files and stored them in locations neither my father nor Ryan could access. Most importantly, we changed nothing that would alert them. Evidence is most valuable when people don't know it's being collected. As weeks passed, their confidence grew. Ryan became bolder in meetings. My father stopped hiding his preference for him. Neither noticed that several board members had quietly begun receiving reports I requested. Neither realized certain transactions were already under review. I wasn't building a trap. I was building a record. Because when the truth finally emerged, I didn't want accusations. I wanted proof. And proof has a way of speaking much louder than anger ever could. The payoff began less than 12 hours after I sent that text from my hospital bed. At sunrise, my attorney activated a series of instructions we had prepared weeks earlier. Independent auditors delivered their findings to the board. Legal notices were sent. Certain accounts were frozen pending review. Emergency meetings were scheduled before my father or Ryan had time to control the narrative. I remained in the hospital, watching events unfold from a distance. For once, silence worked in my favor. By afternoon, board members were examining records neither man knew existed.
Email chains, financial transfers,
authorization requests, and internal communications painted a picture that was impossible to explain away. The facts spoke for themselves. I later watched security footage from headquarters. Ryan entered the boardroom wearing his usual confident smile. He left nearly 2 hours later looking pale and distracted. My father followed several minutes afterward. For the first time in years, he appeared uncertain. Not angry, not defensive, simply uncertain, the same feeling they had spent months creating for me. No dramatic confrontation followed, no triumphant speech. Just consequences. Access privileges were suspended. Investigations expanded. Outside advisors took temporary control of key decisions. The influence they had quietly gathered began slipping through their fingers. That evening, as the sun faded beyond my hospital window, my phone vibrated. A message from my attorney appeared.
The board voted unanimously.
I stared at the screen for several seconds. Then I set the phone down and looked out at the darkening sky. After months of manipulation, lies, and careful planning, the truth had finally entered the room. And unlike me, it couldn't be pushed aside. The fallout unfolded slowly, which somehow made it more powerful. News of the investigation spread through the company within days. Employees who had spent months walking on eggshells suddenly began speaking more openly. Managers shared concerns they had previously kept to themselves. Small details, insignificant on their own, started forming a larger picture. What surprised me most was not the anger. It was the disappointment. Many people had trusted my father. Some had admired Ryan. Watching that trust collapse was painful, even for those of us who had seen the warning signs. Board members who once treated my concerns cautiously now admitted they should have listened sooner. Several privately apologized for dismissing issues that, in hindsight, seemed obvious. My father sent messages asking to talk. Ryan sent none. For the first time, neither of them could rely on influence, charm, or family connections to reshape the story. Their reputation had been built on perception. The truth changed that perception overnight. As for me, the greatest consequence wasn't financial or professional. It was personal. I finally stopped measuring my worth through other people's approval. For years, I had worked harder, spoken softer, and accepted less respect than I deserved because I believed family would eventually recognize my value. They didn't, and that realization was strangely freeing, because sometimes the people who underestimate you never change. The audience should care because betrayal rarely begins with a single dramatic moment. It begins with small compromises, ignored warnings, and misplaced trust. The real victory isn't destroying those who wronged you, it's refusing to let them define who you are. 6 months later, I stood in my grandfather's office and watched the sunrise spill across the city skyline. The room felt different now, not because the furniture had changed, or because the company had returned to stability, because I had changed. The investigations eventually concluded. Some people resigned, others faced legal consequences. My father lost his position on the board, and Ryan disappeared from the business world that had once seemed eager to embrace him. We never had the dramatic reconciliation people expect in stories. Life rarely works that way. My father and I spoke only a handful of times afterward. Those conversations were polite, careful, and marked by the distance that betrayal leaves behind. Some things can be repaired, others simply become part of history. As for the company, it survived. In many ways, it became stronger. Employees who had spent years feeling unheard finally had a voice. Trust was rebuilt slowly, one decision at a time. The culture my grandfather had wanted began to return. For me, the greatest reward wasn't winning. It was peace. I no longer felt the need to prove my worth to people determined not to see it. I stopped chasing approval and started trusting my own judgment. The night in that hospital suite could have been the end of my story. Instead, it became the moment I reclaimed it. Sometimes revenge isn't about making others suffer. Sometimes it's about surviving their betrayal, building something better afterward, and refusing to carry their darkness into your future. And in the end, the most satisfying victory was this. They spent years trying to take everything from me, only to discover that the one thing they could never take was the person I became because of it.